Every summer, without fail, the Martinez family gathered at Riverside Park for their annual reunion, a grand display of sunshine, laughter, and quiet competition disguised as affection. The pattern never changed, it was as predictable as the tides. My cousins would glide into the parking lot in their gleaming new cars, the kind that announced success before the driver even stepped out, dressed in designer clothes that caught the light and conversation alike. Their voices rose above the hum of the crowd, boasting about new promotions, investment portfolios, and luxury getaways as though the whole park had been waiting to applaud them. The aunts and uncles followed their usual script, sipping lemonade and comparing their children's achievements like they were rare collectibles. It was a ritual of subtle judgment and polite smiles, each proud story layered with quiet competition. Somewhere among the chatter, I could always count on Uncle Bob to find his cue, the inevitable moment when he would clear his throat, lean back, and remind everyone that I was, as he liked to say, the family's greatest disappointment. This year promised no surprises. I drove up in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, its hum familiar and unpretentious, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that had seen better days. My clothes didn't shine, but they were clean and comfortable, small acts of quiet defiance in a gathering that worshipped Polish. Through my windshield, I could already see the usual theater of success unfolding. Cousin Derek polishing the hood of his brand-new Porsche, Aunt Carmen flashing her latest collection of jewelry under the sunlight, and Uncle Bob standing near the picnic tables, the self-declared patriarch, surrounded by his audience, laughing heartily at his own business stories. Uncle Bob had taken on that patriarchal role after my father passed away 5 years earlier. He ran a modest but profitable construction company, drove a massive truck worth more than most people's yearly income, and carried himself like a man who had wrestled life into submission. He was proud of his journey, and prouder still of using it as a yardstick to measure everyone else's. He'd worked hard, and he wanted everyone to know it. But somewhere along the way, he'd also decided that success gave him the right to evaluate everyone's life choices, especially mine. I pulled the cooler from my backseat, the one I'd filled with homemade turkey and cheese sandwiches. Nothing fancy, just food made with my own hands. Carrying it toward the picnic tables, I felt like someone walking toward a dentist's chair, bracing myself for discomfort I couldn't avoid. As soon as I approached, the volume of conversation dipped noticeably. It wasn't out of respect, it was anticipation. My arrival meant the main act was about to begin, Uncle Bob's annual performance, What's Wrong with Miguel? Well, Uncle Bob's voice boomed across the tables, sharp and theatrical. Look who finally decided to grace us with his presence. Our little Miguel, still living the dream in that tiny apartment, huh? Laughter rippled lightly through the group. Eyes turned toward me, curious and amused, some tinged with pity. Over the years, I'd grown used to being their family example of what not to become, a walking reminder to their children of what happened when you didn't chase the right dreams. "Hi, Uncle Bob," I said evenly, setting down my cooler. I reached out my hand, enduring his typical bone-crushing handshake, dominance disguised as greeting. "Good to see you," I added politely. "Is it, though?" he asked with a grin that didn't touch his eyes. "Last I heard, you're still at that little clinic downtown, right? What's the pay there? 30, 40 grand a year? Living paycheck to paycheck?" A few polite chuckles followed. I smiled thinly. Something like that. The family began to gather around us, forming a loose semicircle. They knew the rhythm of this play well, the setup, the jokes, the inevitable dissection of my supposed failures. It was entertainment in its most familiar form. "You're 32 now, Miguel," Uncle Bob said, his voice carrying authority. "Most men your age have careers, families, maybe even a house or two. They've built something that lasts. Look at Derek, he's got his own law firm, a house in Westfield, 2 kids in private school. And Carmen's daughter just made partner at her firm. Even little Sophia here has her own marketing business." Sophia smiled, proud and eager for acknowledgement. Her small company managed social media for local shops, decent work, and everyone treated it like an empire. Uncle Bob nodded at her approvingly before turning back to me, his expression tightening. "But you, Miguel," he continued, pointing a finger like a prosecutor. "You're still living like a college kid. Tiny apartment, old car, working for someone else instead of building your future. What happened? Son? Where did we go wrong with you? The air thickened. I could almost hear the silent agreement of my relatives, the familiar murmurs of concern mixed with judgment. It was the same every year. They'd debate my financial decisions, speculate about my lack of ambition, and diagnose my personal life like a group therapy session I'd never signed up for. They never asked why. None of them ever asked what I actually did at that clinic downtown. I'm comfortable with my choices, I said finally, keeping my tone calm. Comfortable, Uncle Bob repeated with a laugh that drew more smiles. That's exactly your problem, Miguel. Comfortable is the enemy of success. You can't build wealth by being comfortable. You can't create a legacy by settling for mediocrity. Derek, ever eager to echo Uncle Bob's wisdom, stepped in. Uncle's right, Miguel. No offense, but don't you want more? A better car, a bigger place, maybe some financial security. Aunt Carmen sighed sympathetically. Some people just don't have that drive, and that's okay, she said softly, as if excusing a condition. It's not about drive, Uncle Bob snapped. It's about making smart choices. And Miguel hasn't made any in a long time. I stayed quiet, letting the words wash over me. The conversation had become a script, one I'd heard too often to react to anymore. But before Uncle Bob could deliver his final sermon on the wasted potential of Miguel Martinez, I noticed a sleek black sedan pull into the lot. It didn't belong to the family, too refined, too understated. The kind of car driven by people who didn't need to flaunt money because everyone already knew they had it. When the driver stepped out, recognition hit me immediately. Dr. Patricia Hendris, Chief of Surgery at Metropolitan General Hospital. My boss. My mentor. And one of the most respected trauma surgeons in the country. What she was doing here, at a family reunion full of folding chairs and bragging uncles, I had no idea. But as Uncle Bob's voice droned on, building up to his yearly crescendo about my generation's lack of ambition, I began to suspect I was about to find out. The afternoon sunlight shimmered over the park, glinting off polished car hoods and golden jewelry as Uncle Bob's voice carried on, steady and self-assured. He was in his element now, speaking loudly enough for nearby families to hear, as though his wisdom should echo beyond our picnic tables. Miguel represents everything wrong with young people these days, he declared, waving his soda can for emphasis. No ambition, no vision, no clue what it means to build something lasting. He's perfectly content being ordinary. His words rippled through the circle like gossip carried on the breeze. I caught Sophia's uncertain smile. She didn't like conflict but wouldn't risk defending me. Derek looked sympathetic in a smug sort of way, as though pity counted as kindness. Aunt Carmen shook her head softly, the picture of disappointment wrapped in concern. I don't think there's anything wrong with ordinary work, Sophia said carefully, her voice barely above the wind. Someone has to staff the hospitals and clinics. Sure, Uncle Bob agreed, pouncing on her words, but those are jobs for people who don't have options. Miguel had options. He went to college, got good grades. He could have done something with his life if he'd just applied himself. As he spoke, Dr. Patricia Hendris began walking toward us across the grass. She was a small woman, elegant but unassuming, her silver hair tied neatly at the back of her neck. Even from a distance, she carried an aura of quiet command, the kind that made seasoned doctors straighten their posture and interns hold their breath. She looked curiously at the scene, like someone walking into a play mid-performance, unsure of the plot but instantly recognizing the tension. The point is, Uncle Bob continued, unaware of her approach, Miguel here is 32, with nothing to show for it. Still renting that little apartment, driving a car older than some of these kids, and working for hourly wages. Hourly wages? Derek repeated, feigning sympathy. That's rough, man. Have you ever thought of going back to school? Maybe get a certification, something that opens new doors. Or start your own practice, Aunt Carmen offered helpfully. You have to think long-term, Miguel. Retirement, savings, the future. The irony nearly made me laugh. They were giving career advice to someone who had already worked 80-hour weeks in trauma centers, who'd spent years stitching broken bodies together in operating rooms they couldn't even imagine. I stayed silent, watching Dr. Hendris draw closer. She was listening now, amusement flickering in her eyes as she pieced together the situation. "What Miguel really needs," Uncle Bob said, his voice swelling as he approached his annual finale, "is a reality check. He needs to understand that life won't hand him success on a silver platter. You have to make something of yourself, not sit around waiting for the world to reward mediocrity." "Bob Martinez." The voice cut through his speech like a scalpel through silk. Calm, precise, impossible to ignore. Uncle Bob turned toward her, the confident grin still plastered on his face. He took one look at her sharp suit, professional posture, and air of success, and immediately shifted gears the way men like him always did around accomplished women. "That's me," he said warmly, extending a hand. "Bob Martinez, Martinez Construction. And you are?" "Dr. Patricia Hendris," she said, shaking his hand with quiet authority. "Chief of Surgery at Metropolitan General Hospital." The name hung in the air for a second before she continued, her voice still courteous but edged with subtle amusement. "I believe your company handled the renovation of our surgical wing last year. Excellent work." Uncle Bob's chest puffed with pride. "That's right. We take quality seriously. Always great to hear from satisfied clients. Are you looking for more development work?" "Actually," Dr. Hendris said, turning to me, "I came here looking for Dr. Martinez. I hope I'm not interrupting, but we have an emergency at the hospital that requires his immediate attention." The silence that followed was almost physical, a sudden, collective stillness that wrapped the park in disbelief. Even the distant sound of children playing seemed to fade. Uncle Bob blinked, confusion flickering behind his confident mask. "I'm sorry. Dr. Martinez?" "That's right," Dr. Hendris replied smoothly. "Dr. Miguel Martinez. Chief Resident in Trauma Surgery at Metropolitan General." You could have heard a leaf fall. Uncle Bob's grin faltered, his hand half raised in disbelief. "Chief Resident," he repeated, his voice smaller now. "Though not for much longer," Dr. Hendris added kindly. "Once he passes his board certification exam next month, and I have no doubt he'll be joining our attending staff as a full trauma surgeon." The air around us thickened with shock. Derek's mouth fell open. Aunt Carmen stared at me as if I had suddenly grown another head. Sophia looked from me to Dr. Hendris, confusion written all over her face. "Dr. Martinez," she continued, turning back to me with professional composure, "I apologize for the intrusion, but we've got a multi-car collision coming in. Several critical cases. I'll need our best trauma surgeon on site." I nodded, regaining my voice. "Of course. I'll follow you over." "Excellent," she said. Then she turned back toward Uncle Bob, whose face had drained of color. "Mr. Martinez," she said gently, "I hope you know how proud you should be of your nephew. He's one of the most promising trauma surgeons I've had the privilege of training in 25 years. The hospital considers him an invaluable asset." Then, with a polite nod, she walked away, leaving behind a silence so thick it pressed against my chest. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. "You're a trauma surgeon?" Derek finally asked, still struggling to form the words. "Yes," I said simply. "As in, you operate on people? Like, in emergencies?" "That's what trauma surgeons do," I replied, calm but not unkind. Uncle Bob sat heavily on the bench, staring at me like I'd just undone the story he'd built about me for years. His voice came out rough. "But, you said you worked at a clinic." "I do," I said. "The trauma clinic at Metropolitan General Hospital. It's part of the emergency department." "And the pay?" Aunt Carmen began weakly. I smiled slightly. Uncle Bob said I made $30,000 or $40,000 a year. I just never corrected him. It was a small truth, but it hit harder than any defense could have. 4 years, they'd assumed and speculated, built a picture of me based entirely on imagination. I'd never bothered to change it because it had always been easier to stay silent than to fight their certainty. "Why?" Sophia's voice trembled slightly. "Why didn't you tell us you were a doctor?" I looked at her for a long moment. "Because none of you ever asked," I said quietly. "In all these years, all these reunions, not one person ever asked what I actually do. You assumed I was some low-level employee and built your stories around that assumption." They looked at each other, uncomfortable, realizing the truth of it. I tried once, I added. 3 years ago, when I started my residency, I mentioned I was beginning surgical training. Uncle Bob laughed and said watching medical dramas didn't count as experience. Uncle Bob winced, the memory flashing across his face like an unwanted replay. Derek rubbed his neck. So you just let us think you were failing? I let you think what you wanted to think, I said evenly. Your version of my life said more about your expectations than it ever did about my reality. The quiet that followed wasn't just silence, it was the slow crumbling of assumptions, the sound of pride deflating. Aunt Carmen finally spoke, her voice soft. But, you live in a tiny apartment. You drive that old car. I do, I said. Because I'm paying off $200,000 in medical school loans as fast as I can. And because I spend most of my time at the hospital anyway. I don't need more space, I need time. Sophia's eyes widened. But with that kind of salary, you could afford a house. A nice one. I could, I agreed. But I'm saving for something more important. The words hung in the air between us, quiet but firm, as though they carried the weight of something larger than explanation. I could see the confusion flicker in their eyes, the slow collapse of the image they'd built of me over the years. For so long, I'd been the one who didn't make it, the one who'd never found success, the one they whispered about with sympathy over coffee. But now, the silence told a different story. Uncle Bob leaned forward, his voice uncertain for the first time that afternoon. Something more important than a house, he repeated, his tone trying to sound casual but failing. What could be more important than that? I took a slow breath, watching the way sunlight filtered through the trees. A life that means something, I said finally. Not just comfort, not just status, purpose. Every time I walk into an operating room, I have a chance to make sure someone else gets another day with the people they love. Another morning. Another heartbeat. That's worth more to me than any house. For a moment, no one said a word. Even the kids playing in the distance seemed to fade into a soft blur, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then Aunt Carmen spoke, her voice gentle but edged with disbelief. But Miguel, don't you ever feel exhausted? All those hours, all that stress, being around so much pain? All the time, I said honestly. There are nights I come home so drained I can barely stand. There are faces I'll never forget, people I couldn't save no matter how hard I tried. But then there are moments when someone's pulse comes back under your hands, when a mother sees her child open their eyes after hours of surgery, when a life that was slipping away suddenly steadies. Those moments make everything worth it. Sophia looked down, her eyes glassy with unspoken emotion. I didn't know, she whispered. I thought you just didn't care about ambition. I gave a small smile. You all talk about ambition like it only lives in offices and stock portfolios. But sometimes ambition is just refusing to give up on a dying patient, even after everyone else has. It's staying awake 36 hours straight because someone's son might still have a chance. It's ambition too, just a different kind. Uncle Bob's mouth tightened. He was still trying to recover his sense of control, still reaching for solid ground. That's admirable, sure, he said carefully. But there's more to life than work. What about stability? What about building something for yourself? I met his gaze steadily. You mean like a business? Exactly, he said, seizing the point. Something tangible. Property. Ownership. I nodded. I own something too, Uncle Bob. It's not made of bricks or steel, but it's real. I own every heartbeat I've saved. Every person I've helped walk out of that hospital when they were supposed to die. I can't sell that, but I can live with it. And when I'm gone, that will matter more than anything else. His jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. He looked away, focusing on his drink as though it might give him a better argument. Aunt Carmen tried to soften the moment. Still, she said, you could have told us, Miguel. We would have been proud of you. I gave a quiet laugh. Not bitter but tired. Would you? Or would you have just turned it into another comparison? Another contest about who's doing better? You never asked because you didn't really want to know, you wanted to feel better about your own choices. My silence just made it easier for everyone. The words hit harder than I expected. Even I felt the weight of them. For years, I had bitten my tongue, smiled through half-truths, and let them paint me as the family disappointment because it was simpler than explaining why their kind of pride never mattered to me. Derek finally spoke, his voice lower, more genuine now. So when you left town years ago, that was for med school? Yes, I said. I moved away for training, came back during residency, but I didn't say much. I learned early that people only listen to the version of your life that fits their story about you. He nodded slowly, the understanding settling over him like a slow dawn. I get that, he said quietly. Sometimes it's easier to stay quiet than to explain yourself to people who already decided what they think. I looked at him, surprised by his sincerity. For the first time, he wasn't trying to outshine anyone. He was just human, like the rest of us. Sophia broke the silence again, her voice fragile. I feel terrible, she murmured. All this time, I thought you were wasting your potential. I told Mom you should find a real career. And you were out there saving people. I smiled faintly. You don't have to feel terrible. You just have to see me, not the version you built in your head. She nodded, eyes glistening. I do now. Uncle Bob cleared his throat, his usual confidence stripped bare. I guess I owe you an apology, Miguel. I didn't mean to. Yes, you did, I said softly. But that's okay. I learned something valuable from it. I learned that people's opinions don't define me. Their silence doesn't break me. I learned that real worth isn't measured by how loudly someone talks about it, but by how quietly someone lives it. The old man looked at me, speechless. For once, his words had failed him completely. Dr. Hendris returned just then, walking briskly across the lawn. Dr. Martinez, the ambulance is en route. ETA 5 minutes. I stood, the conversation dissolving into the background. I'll be right there. She nodded and turned away, but not before glancing briefly at my family, a look of polite recognition mixed with quiet satisfaction. She understood exactly what had just happened. As I gathered my jacket, Sophia stepped closer. Be careful, she said softly. Anne. I'm proud of you. I smiled at her, the tension between us easing like a storm finally passing. Thanks, Soph. As I walked toward the parking lot, I heard Derek whisper to Uncle Bob, you ever notice how heroes never brag about being heroes? Uncle Bob didn't answer. When I reached my car, the same old sedan they'd mocked for years, I paused, hand on the door. For a fleeting moment, I looked back at the picnic tables. They were still sitting there, quiet, humbled, watching me go. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The hum of the motor was soft, steady like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The hospital wasn't far, but in that short drive, I felt a strange peace settle over me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even resentful. I was just free. The truth was out, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to shrink myself to fit their expectations. I didn't need their approval anymore. I'd already earned something better, respect, even if it came late. By the time I reached the hospital, the flashing red lights of the ambulance painted the entrance in streaks of urgency. The doors burst open, and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher a young man, bleeding but breathing. The moment I stepped inside, the noise of the world shifted. All that mattered now was the pulse, the breath, the fight for life. Someone called my name. Dr. Martinez, OR3 is ready. I nodded, pulling on gloves. In that instant, every doubt, every insult, every word of dismissal disappeared. What was left was purpose, sharp, pure, and unstoppable. As I stepped into the operating room, the lights bright above me, I realized something simple and powerful. Sometimes, the best revenge is not success, not wealth, not even recognition. It's peace, knowing you became everything they said you couldn't be, and you did it without needing to prove it. The harsh white lights of the operating room bathed everything in a cold glow, but to me, it was the most familiar place in the world. Every sound, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, the murmur of the anesthesiologist, the faint hiss of the oxygen, felt like music written in urgency. My hands moved on instinct, steady and precise. There was no time to think about family arguments or wounded pride here. Here, there was only life and the fragile thread that held it. Scalpel, I said quietly. The nurse placed it in my hand without hesitation. The weight of it felt grounding, reminding me who I was beneath the noise of other people's opinions. The bleeding was bad, but the damage wasn't beyond hope. The patient was young, 20, maybe 21, with a face that looked peaceful even in unconsciousness. His pulse flickered faintly, like a candle struggling to stay lit. "Pressure's dropping," the anesthesiologist warned. "I see it," I murmured. "We're not losing him today." The words came out like a promise, one I'd made countless times before. Each life felt personal, like a quiet rebellion against everything temporary in the world. In those moments, there was no ego, no title, no applause, just pure, relentless purpose. And that was enough. Hours slipped by in measured silence. When we finally stabilized him, I felt the exhaustion settle deep in my bones. Still, there was that quiet satisfaction, the kind that never makes headlines but fills the soul in ways nothing else can. As I stepped out of the OR, sweat clinging to the edges of my mask, I pulled it down and exhaled. The hospital corridor was quiet now. Outside, the sky had darkened, a soft blue fading into dusk. Dr. Hendris stood by the window, waiting. She turned as I approached, a knowing smile curving her lips. "You saved him." "Barely," I said. "But he'll make it." I never doubted it. She paused, studying me. "Rough day?" I gave a half laugh. "You could say that." "Family reunion." "Ah," she said knowingly. "The battlefield without anesthesia." That made me laugh for real, the sound surprising even me. "Something like that." She smiled gently, eyes wise and kind. "Let me guess, they just found out who you really are?" I nodded. "More or less. People always think they know you," she said softly, "until reality forces them to listen." "I've been there." I looked at her curiously. "Really?" "Oh yes," she said, leaning against the wall. "My own father told me medicine wasn't for women. Said I'd be wasting my life chasing a man's profession. When I made chief of surgery, he told me he was proud. But by then, I didn't need to hear it anymore." I nodded slowly. "That's exactly how it feels. You wait for years to prove yourself, then realize the real victory isn't in proving anything. It's in no longer caring who believes in you." "Exactly," she said softly. "You've already won, Miguel. Don't let their noise dilute your peace." Her words lingered with me long after she walked away. As I stood there, looking out at the city lights shimmering against the night, I thought of the park, the picnic table, the way everyone's faces had fallen when the truth came out. It wasn't satisfaction I'd felt in that moment, it was release. Like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. Still, a part of me wondered what they were thinking now. Did they still see me as the underachiever, or had something shifted in their hearts? I didn't expect miracles, but maybe they understood a little more now. I finished my shift near midnight, the hospital hallways dim and quiet. When I finally stepped outside, the cool air brushed against my skin like a sigh of relief. The city was half asleep, streetlights painting long pools of gold across the asphalt. My phone buzzed. A message from Sophia. "Sophia, we're still at the park. Everyone's been talking about you. Uncle Bob won't stop pacing. Can you come back for a bit?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to go home, shower, and sleep. But another part, maybe the softer part, knew this was unfinished. Closure wasn't always about pride, sometimes it was about understanding. When I pulled back into the park, the picnic was half-packed. The laughter that had filled the afternoon was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. Uncle Bob was standing near the grill, staring into the fading embers, his drink untouched. Sophia saw me first and waved. "Miguel," she called. "You came." Everyone turned. The conversations stopped. I could feel the awkwardness in the air, thick and unspoken. But this time, it didn't weigh me down. Uncle Bob turned slowly, his usual confidence stripped away. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked uncertain. "You came back," he said, almost surprised. "I did," I replied. "Sophia said you wanted to talk." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I did." For a long moment, he just stood there, searching for words that didn't come easily to a man like him. Finally, he sighed. Miguel, I've said a lot of things over the years. Some of them were harsh. I thought I was helping, but I guess I was just trying to make myself feel superior. I didn't know. I didn't even bother to know. I looked at him quietly, letting him speak. He rubbed his hands together, his voice low. You're a better man than I gave you credit for. I mean that. What you do, it's real work. Important work. And I was too proud to see it. Something softened in me then. Uncle Bob had always been a fortress of ego, but now he looked small, human, sincere. Thank you, I said simply. Sophia stepped closer, smiling faintly. He's been talking about you all evening, she said. He actually Googled you. Found an article about one of your surgeries. I laughed, shaking my head. Of course he did. Derek came over next, his usual smirk replaced by something gentler. For what it's worth, man, I've got a lot of respect for you. I couldn't handle that kind of pressure. You'd be surprised what you can handle when it's someone's life on the line, I said quietly. Aunt Carmen reached out and took my hand, her eyes glistening. We were wrong, she said softly. We thought success meant being comfortable. You reminded us it means being useful. I'm proud of you, mijo. The words caught me off guard, hitting deeper than I expected. For years, I'd told myself their opinions didn't matter, but hearing those simple words, it still touched something inside me. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what they did, maybe it was about letting the past stop dictating how I felt. We sat together for a while after that, the night cool and quiet around us. For once, there was no competition, no advice, no judgment. Just understanding. At one point, Uncle Bob chuckled softly. You know, he said, I always told people you were wasting your potential. Turns out, you were out there saving lives while I was bragging about parking lots. I smiled. You build things that last too, Uncle Bob. Just in a different way. He looked up, eyes misty, and nodded. Maybe. But I think yours matters more. The air was filled with the sound of crickets, the faint rustle of leaves. For the first time in years, it felt like family again, not perfect, but human, healing. When I finally stood to leave, Uncle Bob clapped a hand on my shoulder. Next reunion, he said gruffly, I'm bragging about you. I laughed, shaking my head. I'll hold you to that. As I walked back to my car, I realized something simple but profound. Sometimes, life doesn't give you the recognition you deserve when you need it most. But if you stay true to who you are, if you keep doing good quietly, it finds its way back to you, often when you least expect it. The night sky stretched above me, endless and calm. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I was walking toward peace. The drive home that night felt lighter somehow, like the air itself had shed a layer of heaviness. The roads were mostly empty, the city humming quietly around me, lights flickering across wet pavement from a brief drizzle that had passed. For the first time in years, my thoughts weren't circling around old wounds or unspoken frustrations. The silence inside the car wasn't lonely anymore, it was peaceful. I rolled down the window slightly, letting the cool air brush against my face. Somewhere far off, I could still hear Uncle Bob's laughter, the awkward, humbled kind that carried more apology than words ever could. It wasn't just forgiveness that filled the air tonight. It was understanding. And understanding, I realized, is a deeper form of love. When I reached my apartment, everything was as I'd left it, modest, simple, quiet. The same coffee mug sat on the counter, a medical textbook open on the table where I'd left off studying. I didn't see any of it as small or inadequate anymore. It was mine, built through long nights, hard work, and faith in something larger than pride. Every scratch on the furniture, every flickering bulb, every bit of exhaustion embedded in the walls told a story of persistence. I hung my jacket and sat by the window, looking out at the city skyline. The hospital lights gleamed in the distance, a constellation of purpose. My phone buzzed again. A new message. Uncle Bob, you ever sleep? I still can't believe how you do it. Just wanted to say, proud of you, kid. Really proud. I smiled to myself. That message, short, simple, carried more sincerity than any speech he'd ever given. It wasn't just an apology. It was a bridge. Me, thanks, Uncle Bob. Means more than you think. For a moment, I just sat there, rereading those words. It wasn't victory I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was quiet peace, the kind that comes from knowing the truth finally stood on its own, without my having to defend it. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but in the subtle ways that matter most. Uncle Bob called sometimes, not to lecture, but to listen. Derek sent me a message asking for advice about his job, something he'd never done before. Aunt Carmen mailed a small package, a photo from that day at the park, framed neatly, with a note that simply read, "Family isn't about who wins, it's about who learns." Even Sophia changed. One night she came by the hospital after work with takeout and coffee. "You probably haven't eaten," she said, handing me a paper bag. "You know me too well," I laughed, taking it. "I'm learning," she said, smiling softly. "You were right, we didn't really see you before. But we're trying now." We ate together in the hospital cafeteria, the quiet hum of machines in the background. She told me about her own struggles, how she'd felt trapped in the shadow of perfection our family demanded, how judgment had become second nature because it protected her from being judged herself. "I think we all learned something that day," she said finally. "That success doesn't look the same for everyone." "Exactly," I said, smiling. "We all run our own races. Some people build buildings, some save lives, some raise families. The only failure is pretending someone else's dream should be yours." She nodded slowly, eyes soft with realization. "I wish I'd understood that sooner." "Better late than never," I said gently. Later that night, as I walked her to her car, she hugged me for the first time in years. It was the kind of embrace that said everything words couldn't. "I see you, I'm sorry, I'm proud of you." Weeks turned into months. The hospital never slowed down, it never does, but I found myself smiling more often, laughing a little louder. I still drove the same car. Still lived in the same apartment. But something inside me had shifted. I no longer felt like I was carrying the weight of proving myself. I was just living, freely, authentically, quietly fulfilled. One evening, while walking out of the hospital after a particularly long shift, I saw a family waiting near the entrance. A young woman, her face pale with fear, clutched a small child's hand. The boy had a cast on his arm, tears drying on his cheeks. I stopped and knelt down, offering him a gentle smile. "Hey there," I said. "You're going to be okay, champ. You were really brave today." He sniffled, trying to smile back. "You fixed my arm," he said proudly. I nodded. "That's right. Now you just have to promise me one thing, take care of that arm, and no more superhero jumps off the couch, okay?" He giggled, and his mother mouthed a silent thank you. As they walked away, I watched them disappear into the night, her arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. I thought of my family, of how pride and misunderstanding had nearly built a wall between us and how truth had quietly torn it down. Life has a way of circling back like that. The ones who doubt you often become the ones who learn from you, not because you proved them wrong, but because you lived right. The next family reunion came 6 months later. This time, Uncle Bob called personally to invite me. "And don't you dare say you're too busy," he said with a grin in his voice. "We already saved you a seat at the head of the table." When I arrived, everything felt different. The same park, the same tables, the same laughter, but the tone had changed. It wasn't sharp or competitive anymore. It was warm, real, human. Derek waved me over with a smile, Sophia handed me a plate of food, and Aunt Carmen hugged me the moment I stepped in. Uncle Bob stood up from his chair, tapping his glass. "Everyone," he said, clearing his throat. "I just want to say, this family's got a real hero in it. Not the kind who wears a cape, but the kind who keeps hearts beating, literally." Everyone laughed, and I felt my face warm. "Uncle Bob." "No, no," he said, holding up a hand. "You earned this one. We're proud of you, kid. Really proud." I smiled, shaking my head. "I'm proud of you too, Uncle Bob. You finally learned humility." He burst out laughing. "Touché." Laughter rippled through the group, light and unforced. For once, No one was comparing, no one was posturing. Just family, imperfect, evolving, but real. As the evening sun dipped low, casting everything in gold, I looked around and felt something I hadn't in years: belonging. Not the kind that demands you shrink yourself to fit, but the kind that accepts you as you are. Sometimes, I realized, life doesn't change overnight. People don't transform because of one conversation. But when truth is spoken with quiet strength, when you live it instead of shouting it, it plants something deeper than pride. It plants respect. And respect, once it takes root, never dies. As I watched the sky fade into soft orange and the sound of laughter echo across the park, I understood the real lesson hidden in all of it. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone who refuses to see it. Just keep living your truth, because eventually, even the blind learn to recognize light. And when they finally do, it's not your victory they see. It's your peace.